For veteran Ethan, life ended the day his wife died. He was merely existing until a mysterious name, the Sea Spirit, compelled him to search for a forgotten, derelict sailboat. But aboard that vessel, he didn't find peace. He found the secret his wife took to her grave, a hidden legacy with the power to change everything. The discovery shattered all he thought he knew about her final days, forcing him to take on an impossible mission that could either save him or destroy him completely. Please support us by subscribing to our channel. The fog in Port Clyde, Maine, had a taste. It was the taste of salt, cold iron, and the ghosts of long-dead fish. It rolled in from the Atlantic not as a gentle blanket, but as a slow, conquering army, swallowing the docks, the lobster boats, and the gray, salt-bleached houses one by one. For Ethan, the taste was a constant, unwelcome companion, a flavor he could never wash from his mouth, not even with the burn of cheap whiskey. Ethan was 38, but the man who stared back from the bathroom mirror each morning looked decades older. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a frame built by years in the Navy and maintained by the brute force of his work at the fish pier. But the strength was a hollow shell. His face was gaunt, carved into sharp angles by a grief that had whittled him down from the inside out. A tangled reddish-brown beard hid the hard set of his jaw, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were vacant, haunted by a loss so profound they seemed to look straight through the world. He moved through his small, quiet house with the mechanical precision of a man simply running out the clock on his own life. The house was Clara's. Every part of it still held the echo of her presence. The small, colorful paintings of seabirds she had hung on the walls, the worn armchair where she used to curl up with a book, the faint scent of lavender that clung to the curtains. For Ethan, these were not comforts. They were daggers. He had not moved a single thing since the accident in 2024. To do so would be to admit she was truly gone, a truth his heart refused to accept even as his mind screamed it at him every waking moment. His days were a flat repeating line: wake, stare at the empty space in the bed beside him, go to the docks, lift, haul, stack, come home, drink, sleep, repeat. The physical ache from heaving crates of haddock and cod onto refrigerated trucks was a welcome distraction. It was a clean, simple pain, one he could understand. It was the other pain, the one that lived in his chest, that was the enemy. "Mornin', Ethan," a voice boomed behind him. It was Gus, the pier foreman, a barrel of a man with a cheerful, weathered face and hands like catcher's mitts. Ethan grunted, not turning around, as he slung another 50-pound crate onto the pallet. "Gonna be a wet one," Gus continued, undeterred. "Feels like the sky's about to fall out. You got that new shipment of bait ready for the sea serpent?" "Done," Ethan said, his voice a low rasp. It was the first word he'd spoken all day. He pointed a thumb toward a stack of covered barrels near the wharf's edge. Gus sighed, the sound lost in the cry of a circling gull, and walked away. Ethan did not watch him go. He did not care. The conversations were always the same, small offerings of connection that he could not, would not, accept. That evening, the routine continued. He sat at the small kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey and a single glass his only company. The rain, Gus had predicted, finally arrived, lashing against the windows in thick, angry sheets. The sound was a torment, dragging him back to another rainy night, another set of headlights skidding on wet pavement. He squeezed his eyes shut and poured another drink, the liquid burning a path down his throat. His gaze fell upon a photograph on the mantelpiece. It was the last one he had taken of Clara. She was standing on the beach, her red jacket a splash of vibrant life against the gray rocks, her smile so bright it seemed to mock the gloom of the room. He remembered the feel of the wind whipping her hair across her face, the sound of her laughter as she'd thrown her arms out to embrace the world. He looked away, the memory too sharp, too painful. He drank until the edges of the room blurred, until Clara's smiling face faded into a dull, manageable ache. He stumbled to bed, falling into a heavy, dreamless sleep. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of pale, fragile blue and air that felt crisp and new. Ethan felt no such renewal. He felt only the familiar, dull throb of a hangover and the weight of another day to be endured. He pulled on his boots and walked, not to the docks but in the opposite direction, toward the old, disused shipyard at the edge of town. He didn't know why. His feet just seemed to carry him there. The shipyard was a skeleton, a place of rust and rot, old hulls listed in the mud, their ribs exposed to the elements. The air was thick with the smell of decay and creosote. It was a place where things came to die, and it suited his mood perfectly. He walked along a crumbling retaining wall, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the ground. And then he saw him. Across a field of weeds and broken machinery, a dog was watching him. It was a German shepherd. Though it was so thin, its breed was only just recognizable. Its coat was a matted mix of gray and white, the color of seafoam and storm clouds. Its ribs were a faint outline beneath its fur, and it stood with a tense, guarded posture, one paw lifted slightly off the ground, ready to bolt. It was the picture of wariness and isolation. Ethan stopped. He and the dog stared at each other across the 50 yards of urban decay. The dog's ears were pricked forward, its intelligent amber eyes fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. It didn't bark or growl. It just watched. There was no aggression in its stance, only a profound, deep-seated caution, the look of a creature that had learned that the world was not a kind place. Ethan didn't move. He didn't call out or try to approach. He simply stood there, the cool morning air on his face, and looked at this other, lost soul. In the dog's gaunt frame, he saw the reflection of his own hollowed-out existence. In its guarded, watchful eyes, he recognized the same invisible wall he had built around his own heart. For a long, silent moment, two solitary beings, one man and one dog, shared a silent understanding in the wreckage of the old shipyard. The moment held for an eternity, then shattered. The German shepherd took a single nervous step back, its body language a clear signal of retreat. It turned and vanished into the labyrinth of rusted metal and decaying wood as silently as it had appeared. Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He didn't follow. He turned and walked back toward the town, but the image of the dog's cautious, lonely eyes was burned into his mind. He couldn't explain the pull, the dull ache of recognition he'd felt. For the first time in over a year, something other than his own grief had pierced the thick fog of his apathy. The next day, after his shift, he found himself walking back to the shipyard. He told himself it was just to clear his head. But clutched in his hand was a can of beef stew from his own pantry, one he knew he wouldn't eat. He saw the dog almost immediately, a flicker of gray and white watching him from the shadows of a derelict fishing trawler. It was in the same spot, as if it were a ghost bound to this place of endings. Ethan didn't try to get closer. He opened the can, prized the lid back, and set it on a relatively clean patch of concrete. Then he retreated, walking back to the crumbling retaining wall, where he'd first seen the animal. He sat down and waited. Minutes stretched into a half hour. The dog did not move. Ethan remained still, his patience a new and unfamiliar feeling. Finally, after the sun had begun to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows across the yard, the dog crept forward. It moved with the fluid caution of a wild animal, its head low, its eyes never leaving Ethan's distant figure. It reached the can, snatched a mouthful of meat and potatoes, and darted back into the shadows to eat. It repeated this process until the can was empty. This became their ritual. Every day, Ethan would bring an offering. Sometimes it was a can of dog food he'd bought at the town's general store, feeling a strange sense of purpose as he placed it on the counter. Other times it was the leftovers from his own dinner. And every day he would wait as the dog, his silent companion in this lonely vigil, slowly, painstakingly, began to trust him. The distance between them shrank by inches. After 2 weeks, the dog no longer retreated fully into the shadows to eat. It would stand by the offering, one eye always on Ethan. After 3, Ethan could remain standing 50 feet away, and the dog would still approach the food. He began to see the changes in the animal. The food was filling out its gaunt frame, and its matted coat was starting to look thicker. The fear in its eyes was slowly being replaced by a watchful curiosity. He started talking to it, his voice low and rusty from disuse. "Bet you've seen some things, huh, boy?" he murmured one afternoon, as the dog licked the last of the gravy from a tin plate. "Yeah, me too." It was then that he gave him a name. He looked at the dog's coat, the mix of weathered grays and whites that reminded him of sea spray on old timber. He thought of the taste of the air, the grit of their shared existence on the edge of the ocean. "Salty," he said quietly. "I'll call you Salty." The dog's ears twitched at the sound. It looked at him, its head cocked to one side, a flicker of understanding in its intelligent gaze. It was the first time Ethan had felt a genuine connection to another living being since Clara was gone. The breakthrough came a month after their first meeting. Ethan set down a bowl of fresh water and food and sat on an overturned lobster trap only 30 feet away. Salty watched him for a long time, then walked calmly to the bowl and began to eat, his tail giving a single tentative wag. Ethan's breath hitched. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental, a bridge being built over a chasm of loneliness and fear. That evening, as Ethan got up to leave, something different happened. A shadow detached itself from the gloom of the shipyard and trailed him at a distance. It was Salty. The dog followed him all the way to the edge of the town, stopping where the cracked pavement of the shipyard met the neat asphalt of the residential streets. It watched until Ethan disappeared inside his quiet house. The next night, Salty followed him onto the street. The night after that, he followed him to his front door. He didn't try to come in, but sat on the porch, a silent, watchful guardian. Ethan left the door cracked open, a silent invitation. In the middle of the night, he woke to a soft sound from the living room. He walked out to find Salty curled up on the old rug in front of the cold fireplace, his head on his paws. He was finally home. Salty became his shadow. He followed Ethan to the docks in the morning, where he would lie quietly near a stack of unused nets, watching the men work with a calm, dignified air. Gus, the foreman, just shook his head and smiled. "Looks like you got a first mate, Ethan." Ethan didn't reply, but he gave Salty a quick scratch behind the ears as he walked past. The silence in the house was different now. It was no longer the oppressive, empty silence of grief, but a comfortable, shared silence, punctuated by the soft thump of Salty's tail against the floor or the quiet click of his nails on the hardwood. Ethan was still broken, still lost in his sorrow, but he was no longer completely alone. Salty's steady, unassuming presence was a tether, a small anchor in the storm of his memories. One afternoon, their walk took them deep into the shipyard, further than they usually went. Salty was trotting ahead, sniffing at the base of a rusted crane, which made Ethan pause. Nearby, 2 old men sat on a pile of lumber, mending a fishing net. They were local fixtures, men whose faces had been carved by decades of sun and sea. "It's a shame is what it is," one of the men said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Just sitting there, rotting away." "Aye," the other agreed. "Been there since old man Hemlock passed. Nobody's touched it. A fine boat in her day, though, real fine. The Sea Spirit." The name snagged in Ethan's mind. The Sea Spirit. He felt a strange jolt, a flicker of a memory so distant he couldn't grasp it. He didn't know why, but the name felt familiar, like a word from a half-forgotten dream. Salty trotted back to his side and nudged his hand with a wet nose, but Ethan didn't notice. He was staring out at the rows of decaying hulls, a question forming in his mind for the first time in a very long year. The name echoed in the hollow spaces of Ethan's memory. The Sea Spirit. He felt an urgency he hadn't known in months, a sharp, insistent curiosity that was almost painful. Salty, sensing the sudden shift in his master's demeanor, looked up with a low whine. "Where is it?" Ethan asked the two old fishermen, his voice startlingly loud in the quiet yard. "The sea spirit. Where is she?" The older of the two men, whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles, pointed a thick, gnarled finger toward a forgotten corner of the shipyard, half hidden behind a mountain of rotting lobster traps. "Right over there. Hasn't moved in years. Good luck to you." With Salty trotting at his heels, Ethan navigated the maze of discarded equipment, and then he saw her. The boat was in worse shape than he could have imagined. It was a sailboat, maybe 35 feet long, sitting awkwardly on a series of moss-covered wooden blocks. Her hull, once white, was now a peeling, leprous gray, streaked with rust and green algae. A thick layer of grime and bird droppings coated every surface. The rigging was frayed, the sails were gone, and the beautiful woodwork of the cabin was weathered and split. She looked less like a vessel and more like a tombstone. Yet, as Ethan stared at the wreck, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into his mind. He saw it with perfect clarity. A photograph from their last anniversary. It sat on their bedside table, a picture he saw every single day but hadn't truly looked at since she was gone. It was a picture of Clara, laughing, standing on a dock in a nearby harbor. And in the background, tied to the pilings, was this exact boat. He could remember her name, written in faded blue letters across the stern. The Sea Spirit. He had thought it was just some random boat. He had never imagined. A new energy surged through him. He had to get aboard. The wooden ladder leading to the deck was missing several rungs, but Ethan, with a strength born of desperation, hauled himself up, his boots finding purchase on the thick chain plates. Salty waited below, looking up with anxious, intelligent eyes. The deck groaned under his weight. Everything was decay. He found the companionway hatch leading down to the cabin. It was swollen shut with years of rain and neglect. He threw his shoulder against it once, twice, and on the third try, the wood splintered, and the hatch slid open with a screech of protest. The air that rose from the cabin was thick and musty, the smell of trapped memories and damp rot. He descended the short steps into the gloom. Inside, it was even worse. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light, slanting through a grimy porthole. The cushions on the benches were covered in mildew, and a thin layer of dirt coated every surface. He began to search, not knowing what he was looking for. He pulled open a drawer, near the small navigation station, and his fingers brushed against a thick, waterproof pouch. He pulled it out. Inside were the boat's official documents. His eyes scanned the papers, his heart hammering against his ribs. The bill of sale was dated the 12th of March 2024, just 3 weeks before the accident. The buyer, Clara Hale. The seller, a local fisherman named Silas Croft. The price was shockingly low. A pittance for a boat of this size. She had bought it. This wreck, this ghost of a boat, had belonged to his wife. He sat down heavily on a dusty bench, the papers trembling in his hand. Why? Why had she never told him? Salty, sensing his distress, let out a soft bark from the dock below. The sound pulled Ethan from his stupor. He looked around the cabin again, his eyes now searching for a different kind of clue. It was Salty who found it. After Ethan had managed to rig a makeshift ramp for him, the dog immediately began sniffing intently at the base of the main bunk, his tail low and stiff. He pawed at a single, slightly raised floorboard, then looked up at Ethan and whined, a low, insistent sound. Curious, Ethan knelt. He worked his fingers under the edge of the board and pulled. It came up with a groan of old wood, and there, nestled in the dark, dusty space of the bilge, was a small, hand-carved wooden box. It was a box he recognized. He had made it for her himself in a high school woodshop class, clumsy and imperfect, but she had treasured it. With trembling hands, he lifted the box out and opened the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a leather-bound journal. He opened it to the first page. It was Clara's handwriting, neat and clear and full of life. The Sea Spirit Project, the title read. The journal was filled with her dreams. Page after page contained meticulous drawings of the boat's layout, detailed plans for restoring the woodwork, swatches of fabric for new cushions, and lists of equipment they would need. She had sketched the coast of Maine, the islands of the Caribbean, the shores of the Mediterranean. It was a roadmap to a future he never knew she was planning. Beneath the journal was a simple blue bank passbook. He opened it. The account was in her name only. The title, written in her own hand on the first line, read, Sea Spirit Restoration Fund. He stared at the balance, his vision blurring with tears. It was a substantial amount, more than enough to begin. It was money she had been carefully, secretly, saving for years, a testament to how real, how tangible this dream had been for her. He sat there, in the dark, decaying cabin of his wife's secret boat, holding the proof of her unwavering hope in his hands. This wasn't a whim. This was a legacy. She hadn't been drifting away from him in those final months. She had been building a lifeboat for them both, a vessel to carry them away from their quiet, ordinary life and into a shared adventure. The grief was still there, a great, crushing weight. But now, for the first time, something else rose to meet it. It was a flicker of purpose, a tiny, defiant flame in the vast darkness of his loss. He looked down at the journal, at Clara's drawings of a restored, beautiful boat sailing on a calm blue sea. He looked at Salty, who had rested his head on his knee, a warm, solid weight in the suffocating silence. He knew what he had to do. This would not be a place where things came to die. It would be a place where things began again. He would finish what she started. He would take her secret, her beautiful, impossible dream, and he would make it real. It was the only thing left to do. The initial flame of purpose was quickly doused by the cold, hard reality of the task ahead. Ethan knew how to navigate a ship, how to read the weather and the stars, how to tie 100 different knots, but he knew nothing about building one. Clara's journal was full of dreams and sketches, but it wasn't a manual. Looking at the rotted planks and rusted fittings of the Sea Spirit, he felt a wave of profound helplessness wash over him. The savings account held a small fortune, but without the knowledge to use it, it was just paper in a book. There was only one name in Port Clyde that was synonymous with boat building: Finn. Everyone knew of him, though few knew him well. He was a master craftsman from a bygone era, a man who could build a ship from the keel up with nothing but his hands and an encyclopedic knowledge of wood and wind. He was also, by all accounts, a cantankerous old hermit who hadn't taken on a project in over a decade. Finding him wasn't hard. His house was a small, saltbox cottage on a windswept point overlooking the sea, with a large workshop attached. The yard was a chaotic but orderly jumble of lumber, old winches, and the skeletal frames of half-forgotten dories. Ethan took a deep breath, the scent of sawdust and turpentine filling his lungs, and knocked on the heavy oak door. Salty sat at his feet, calm and watchful. The door creaked open to reveal a man who looked as though he'd been carved from the same tough, weathered timber he worked with. Finn was short and wiry, with a shock of white hair that defied gravity and a beard that reached his chest. His face was a network of deep lines, and his eyes, a startlingly bright blue, were sharp and missed nothing. They flicked from Ethan's face, down to Salty, and back up again, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. "What do you want?" Finn's voice was a low growl, like stones grinding together. "My name is Ethan Hale," he began, his own voice sounding thin and uncertain. I've acquired a boat, the Sea Spirit. She's in the old shipyard. I need help restoring her." Finn stared at him for a long moment, his expression unchanging. Then he let out a short, harsh laugh. "The Sea Spirit? You mean that piece of firewood? Son, you haven't acquired a boat. You've acquired a hole in the water you pour money into. Go home. Save yourself the trouble." He started to close the door. "Wait," Ethan said, desperation making him bold. "Please, it was my wife's boat. Her name was Clara." The door stopped moving. Finn's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't say anything, so Ethan pressed on, the words tumbling out. He explained how he had found the boat, about the journal and the savings account, about Clara's secret dream. He laid his entire broken heart bare on the doorstep of this strange, hostile old man. When he finished, the silence stretched, thick and heavy. "Dreams don't make a boat float," Finn said, his voice flat. "Passion doesn't make a plank watertight. You're a fool, chasing a ghost. You'll spend every penny your wife saved and end up with nothing but a prettier wreck. Now get off my property." He shut the door. The final solid click of the latch felt like a judgment. Defeated, Ethan turned to leave, a familiar bitterness rising in his throat. Of course, it was a stupid idea. Finn was right. He was a fool. Salty whined and nudged his hand, as if trying to pull him away from the place of rejection. He had taken 2 steps when the door creaked open again. "What was the name you said?" Finn asked, his voice softer now, stripped of its earlier harshness. Ethan turned back. "The boat? The sea spirit." Finn's gaze seemed to look past him, out toward the gray horizon. "Number, your wife. What was her name?" "Clara," Ethan said. Finn was silent for a long time. The wind whistled around the corners of the cottage. "She came to see me," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "The girl, Clara, about 6 months ago. Red jacket, hair like a sunset, full of questions. Smart ones. She didn't just want to know how to fix a boat. She wanted to know its soul. Ask me about the grain of the wood, why you use oak for the ribs and cedar for the planks. Knew the history of every rig I mentioned." He paused, a flicker of memory in his bright blue eyes. "I was impressed. Haven't met a soul with that kind of fire in, well, a long time." She asked if I would help her with the sea spirit. "What did you say?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. "I said no," Finn admitted, looking down at his gnarled hands. "Told her I was too old. Told her it was too much work. The truth is, I was afraid. Afraid to put my heart into something just to watch it fail. I sent her away." He looked up, and for the first time, Ethan saw not a hermit, but a man full of a deep and abiding regret. "I see that same fire in your eyes, and in that dog's. He hasn't taken his eyes off you once. That's a loyalty you can't buy." "I almost said." Finn looked from Ethan's determined face to Salty's unwavering gaze, and then back to the closed door of his workshop, as if seeing the ghost of the young woman who had stood there months before. The fight seemed to go out of him, replaced by a weary resignation. "I won't do the work for you," he said, his voice firm again, but without the hard edge. "But I will teach you. I'll show you how to hold a tool, how to read the wood, how to bring that ship back from the dead. But you will do the work. Every cut, every seam, every coat of varnish will be yours. It'll be the hardest thing you've ever done. You'll curse me, you'll curse the boat, and you'll curse your wife for her ridiculous dream. Are you ready for that?" Ethan looked at the old man, this unlikely beacon in his sea of grief. He looked down at Salty, who sat patiently by his side, a silent promise of companionship. And he thought of Clara's journal, of her boundless, impossible hope. "Yes," Ethan said, his voice clear and steady. "I am." Finn nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "All right then, be here tomorrow. Sunrise, and bring the dog. I like him." He turned and went back inside, leaving the door open just a crack. It was an invitation. True to his word, Finn was waiting when Ethan arrived the next morning, the rising sun painting the sky in pale hues of orange and pink. A mug of steaming coffee was in the old man's hand, but there was none for Ethan. There was only a dusty, splintered plank of oak and a rusty hand plane. "Your wife's money can buy the lumber," Finn said, his voice a gravelly rumble in the quiet morning. "It can't buy you the skill to use it. Before you touch her boat, you will learn the tool. You will make this plank smooth, perfectly smooth. So smooth a drop of water will sit on it like a jewel." For 3 days, that was Ethan's world. He didn't set foot on the sea spirit. He stood in Finn's workshop, his muscles burning, his hands blistering as he pushed the heavy plane across the plank. Every time he thought he was finished, Finn would run a calloused finger over the surface, find an imperceptible flaw, and shake his head. Again. It was infuriating. Ethan's frustration grew into a hard knot in his chest. This was pointless. The boat was rotting away while he was wasting time on a single piece of wood. But each morning, he returned. And each day, Salty lay on a bed of sweet-smelling wood shavings in a corner of the workshop, a calm, steady presence in the storm of Ethan's impatience. When Finn was finally satisfied, the real work began, and it was worse than Ethan could have imagined. The first phase was not construction, but destruction. Armed with crowbars and hammers, he had to tear out the rotted heart of the sea spirit. Every plank he pried loose felt like a desecration, like he was destroying the very thing he had promised to save. The damp, decaying wood crumbled in his hands, filling the air with the stench of mildew and death. It was brutal, soul-crushing labor. Clara's savings were enough for the basic materials, as Finn had predicted, but they could not account for the sheer physical and mental toll. Ethan's body ached in ways it hadn't since his Navy training. His hands were a mass of cuts and calluses. He made mistakes constantly. He measured a new piece of cedar for the cabin wall, cut it, and found it was an inch too short. He drove a bronze screw too hard, snapping its head off. He let a chisel slip, gouging a deep scar in a piece of otherwise perfect mahogany. Each mistake was met with Finn's unsparing criticism. The old man never yelled. His corrections were quiet, sharp, and cut deeper than any shout. "You're fighting it," Finn said, picking up the board Ethan had nearly thrown across the yard in frustration. "You see this knot here? It's not a flaw. It's the wood's history. It's where a branch grew. It's strong. You can't force a straight line through it. You have to work with it. You have to listen to what the wood wants to be. And for had is a dox, 8 non-dot-alis." Finn took the board and, with a few deft strokes of a small saw, altered the shape of the piece, incorporating the knot into a graceful, stronger curve. "There. It's not what you planned, but it's better. Sometimes the breaks and the scars are what make something stronger. You can't just throw away every piece that isn't perfect." The words hung in the air between them. Ethan knew Finn wasn't just talking about wood. He was talking about him. He was a man full of knots and flaws, a person who felt broken beyond repair. Finn was teaching him, in his own gruff, indirect way, that even the most damaged things could be mended, not by erasing the flaws, but by building around them. It was a slow, agonizing lesson in patience and acceptance. There were days when the despair was a physical weight, when the scale of the project seemed insurmountable. On those days, Ethan would sit on the edge of the deck, his head in his hands, the bitter taste of failure in his mouth, and on those days, Salty was his savior. The big German shepherd seemed to have an innate sense of his master's moods. He was a silent, constant source of encouragement. When Ethan dropped a wrench into the dust, Salty would gently pick it up in his soft mouth and carry it back to him. When he sat, lost in a dark memory of Clara, Salty would leave his sunny spot and come to rest his heavy head on Ethan's knee, his warm, steady breathing a comforting rhythm in the quiet shipyard. He asked for nothing, demanded nothing. He was simply there, a furry, four-legged testament to loyalty and faith. His presence was the one thing Ethan could count on, the one perfect, unbroken thing in his fractured world. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The pile of rotten wood beside the boat grew, and slowly, painstakingly, new life began to emerge. The first new ribs, smelling of fresh-cut oak, were fitted into the hull. The first new planks were fastened into place. Ethan's movements became more certain, his hands more steady. He was learning to listen. He could feel the grain of the wood under his fingers, could anticipate how a saw would move through it. The work was still hard, but it was no longer just a task. It was a meditation. It was a prayer. It was the slow, difficult work of putting the pieces of a life back together. Port Clyde was a small town, and like all small towns, it ran on a currency of stories. For over a year, the story of Ethan Hale had been a sad, quiet one. The heartbroken Navy man who lost his vibrant wife and then lost himself in a bottle. People spoke of him in hushed, sympathetic tones. They saw him at the docks, a ghost moving among the living, his eyes perpetually fixed on a horizon no one else could see. But stories, like the tides, can turn. The first whispers of a new story began at the marine supply store, a place that smelled of varnish and new rope. Then they spread to the fish pier, and from there to the town's only tavern. The new story was about the sea spirit, the old wreck in the shipyard. It was about Clara's secret dream. And it was about Finn, the town's resident hermit, taking on an apprentice for the first time in anyone's memory. People started to watch, from a distance at first. They saw Ethan's truck at the shipyard every morning at sunrise and saw it leave long after sunset. They saw the pile of rotten wood grow and then, slowly, be replaced by stacks of fresh, sweet-smelling lumber. They saw the ghost begin to take shape again, his shoulders straightening, his movements gaining a purpose they hadn't had in years. They no longer saw a man drowning in his past. They saw a man trying to build a future. The first person to cross the invisible line between watching and helping was a woman named Mary Gable. She was a kind, sturdy woman in her late 50s who ran Gable's Marine Supply. Her hands were as capable of splicing a rope as they were of running a ledger. She had known Clara, had admired her bright, inquisitive spirit. She had watched with a heavy heart as Ethan had faded after the accident. One afternoon, Ethan walked into her store, a list from Finn in his hand. He needed a box of silicone bronze screws and a specific type of marine epoxy. They were expensive. As Mrs. Gable set the items on the counter, she looked at him, her eyes full of a gentle warmth. "I heard what you're doing, Ethan," she said softly. "For Clara, it's a beautiful thing." Ethan just nodded, his gaze fixed on the counter, uncomfortable with the direct kindness. "Clara used to come in here, you know," Mrs. Gable continued, ringing up the total. "She'd ask 100 questions about everything. Wanted to know why one varnish was better than another for this climate. Smart as a whip, that one." She paused, then slid the box of screws toward him and pushed his money back across the counter. "This is on the house. A down payment on seeing that boat sail again." Ethan looked up, startled. "I can't." "You can, and you will," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You just let me know what else you need. We'll work something out." 8. I'm knowed after Liv. He left the store that day with more than just screws and epoxy. He left with the strange, unsettling feeling of a debt he could not immediately repay, the first crack in the wall he had built so carefully around himself. The next offering came from the sea itself. A few of the fishermen he used to work alongside at the pier approached him one evening as he was packing up his tools. One of them, an older man named Silas, the very man who had sold the boat to Clara, held out a massive coil of thick, braided rope. It was used, but still strong and supple. "It's no good to me, just sittin' in my shed," Silas said, his voice gruff with the awkwardness of the gesture. The sea was Clara's dream. It's only right a piece of our gear helps her get there. Ethan took the rope, its heavy, familiar weight a comfort in his hands. "Thank you, Silas," he murmured. It was a small thing, but it was a start. The help shifted from materials to manpower the following Saturday. Ethan and Finn were wrestling with a long, heavy oak plank, trying to bend it into the gentle curve of the hull, when the sound of footsteps made them look up. It was Gus, the pier foreman, along with two younger fishermen. "Mornin', Finn." "Ethan," Gus said, tipping his cap. "Figured you could use a few more pairs of hands. Many hands make light work, they say." Ethan tensed. He was used to the quiet rhythm of working alone with Finn. The thought of more people, more noise, more interaction felt like an intrusion. But looking at their earnest, friendly faces, he found he couldn't say no. He gave a short, stiff nod. The day was a revelation. With 4 extra men, the work moved at a pace Ethan couldn't have imagined. The air, usually filled only with the sounds of tools and Finn's terse instructions, now held the low murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter. They worked, they shared a lunch of sandwiches and coffee, and they talked. They talked about fishing, about the weather, about the town. They included Ethan in their circle, not by forcing him to speak, but by simply making a space for him to be. Salty, in the middle of it all, was in his element. He moved between the men, his tail wagging, accepting a scratch behind the ears from Gus or a piece of sandwich crust from one of the younger men. He became the project's official greeter, the social bridge between the quiet, grieving man and the community that wanted to reach him. He was no longer just Ethan's dog. He was the shipyard dog, the mascot of the Sea Spirit. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the harbor, the men packed up to leave. "See you next Saturday," Gus said, clapping Ethan on the shoulder. It wasn't a question. After they had gone, Ethan stood on the deck of the half-finished boat, a warm thermos of coffee in his hand. Finn was beside him, and Salty was lying at his feet, his head resting on Ethan's boot. He looked out at the town of Port Clyde, at the lights twinkling on in the houses along the shore. For months it had been a place of ghosts and painful memories. But now, it was starting to feel like something else. It was starting to feel like home. The months bled into one another, marked not by the calendar, but by the slow transformation of the Sea Spirit. The gaping wounds in her hull were now sealed with new, strong planks of cedar. The deck, once a treacherous landscape of soft spots and splintered wood, was now solid and whole. Progress was slow, but it was steady. The work had become a rhythm, a purpose that ordered Ethan's days and quieted the ghosts in his mind. Most of the time, he was working inside the main cabin, carefully restoring a set of built-in lockers that Finn had deemed salvageable. The community help was a weekend blessing, but the intricate interior work fell to him on the long, quiet weekday evenings. The air smelled of sawdust and lemon oil as he gently sanded a drawer front, the repetitive motion a familiar comfort. Salty was asleep in a patch of moonlight near the companionway, his paws occasionally twitching as he chased dream rabbits. As he removed the last of the small drawers to clean the inside of the cabinet, his fingers brushed against something in the dark, recessed corner. It wasn't a part of the boat. It was a small wooden box, different from the one he had found before. This one was smaller, smoother, made of a dark, polished cherry wood. He knew this box, too. It was a jewelry box he had given Clara for their first Christmas together in 2018. His heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He lifted the box out and carried it to the center of the cabin, where the moonlight was brightest. He sat on the floor, his back against a newly installed bulkhead, and slowly opened the lid. Salty, woken by the sudden stillness, lifted his head and watched him, his amber eyes soft with concern. The box didn't hold jewelry. It held memories. On top was a small stack of photographs, dog-eared and faded from time. The first was of the two of them, impossibly young, standing on the pier right here in Port Clyde, squinting into the Sunday. He was in his navy dress whites, home on leave, his arm wrapped tightly around her. She was beaming, her face full of a light he had forgotten he'd ever been able to inspire. Another photo showed them laughing in the small kitchen of their first apartment, covered in flour from a failed attempt at baking a cake. He looked at the man in the pictures, at his easy smile and clear, untroubled eyes. He felt a profound and dizzying disconnect, as if he were looking at a stranger, a ghost from a life that belonged to someone else. The man in those photos was whole. He was happy. He was not the hollowed-out creature he was today. Beneath the photos was a single, sealed envelope of pale blue stationery. His name was written on the front in Clara's familiar, elegant script. It had never been mailed. With trembling fingers, he broke the seal. The letter was dated a month before her accident. "My dearest Ethan," the letter began. If you are reading this, it probably means I've finally worked up the courage to show you the big, silly, wonderful secret I've been keeping out at the old shipyard. I hope you aren't mad. I hope you see what I see. Not a wreck, but a promise. I've been feeling a distance between us lately. Not a bad distance, not a canyon, but a quiet, sad little river that has started to flow where we used to be, solid ground. We both got so lost in the rhythm of life, in the work and the worry, that I think we forgot how to dream together. I see you, my love. I see the weariness in your eyes when you come home from the docks. I see the ghost of the ocean you loved still haunting you. I bought this boat for us, so we could have a project, a shared dream to build with our own two hands. So I could see that old light come back into your eyes. I dream of us out on the water, with nothing but the sun and the sea and the wind, finding our way back to the kids who fell in love on that pier all those years ago. The sea spirit. She's not just a boat, Ethan. She's our way home. All my love, forever, Clara. A sound tore from Ethan's throat, a raw, ragged sob that echoed in the small, empty cabin. The letter fell from his numb fingers. The carefully constructed dam he had built against his grief didn't just crack, it shattered into a million pieces. He wasn't just grieving her death. He was grieving this, the beautiful, hopeful future she had been planning for them, a future he had been too blind, too lost in his own quiet misery to see. The regret was a physical poison, burning through his veins. He had been a ghost in his own life long before she had died, and she had seen it. She had tried to save him, and he had failed her. The boat was not a tribute. It was a monument to his failure. The work, the community, Finn's lessons, it was all a lie. He was just a broken man, hammering together pieces of wood, pretending it meant something. He wanted to take a sledgehammer and destroy it all, to smash every new plank, every carefully fitted joint, until it was all just firewood. He wanted to give up. He curled in on himself, the sobs shaking his entire body, his face buried in his hands. The pain was absolute, a black ocean with no shore. Then, he felt a gentle, persistent pressure against his side. A warm weight settled on his lap. He lowered his hands to see Salty, who had crept forward and was now pushing his head insistently into Ethan's chest. The dog whined, a low, sorrowful sound, and licked the tears from his master's face. Ethan wrapped his arms around the dog's thick, warm neck and clung to him. He buried his face in Salty's fur, which smelled of sawdust and the clean, salt air. The dog didn't flinch. He just stood there, a solid, living anchor in the swirling chaos of Ethan's despair. The steady, rhythmic beat of Salty's heart against his cheek was a reminder of life, of loyalty, of a love that asked for nothing in return. He didn't know how long they stayed like that, a man and his dog huddled together in the moonlight-drenched hull of a half-finished dream. Salty's silent, unwavering comfort didn't make the pain go away, but it made it bearable. It was a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge of the abyss. He was still broken, still lost. But as he held on to his loyal friend, he knew, with a certainty that cut through the grief, that he was not going to sink. He would not give up. He had to keep going. For Clara. And now, for Salty, too. The passing of summer into fall was a quiet, beautiful thing in Port Clyde. The air grew crisp, the leaves on the trees inland turned to fire, and the low-angled sun cast a golden light across the harbor. On the Sea Spirit, the change was even more profound. She was no longer a skeleton. She was a nearly whole and beautiful creature, a testament to a season of relentless, hopeful work. Her hull was painted a deep, classic navy blue, with a single, clean white line just below the deck. The woodwork on her cabin glowed with a dozen coats of fresh varnish, reflecting the blue sky above. Her new mast, a magnificent piece of Sitka spruce that Finn had sourced from a boatyard up the coast, stood tall and proud, waiting for the sails that were being sewn by a sailmaker in the next town over. Ethan, too, was transformed. The gaunt, haunted look was gone, replaced by the lean, sun-browned strength of a man who worked with his hands and his heart. The ghosts were still there, but they no longer walked in front of him. They walked beside him, quietly. The work had settled into a satisfying rhythm of finishing touches, polishing the new bronze portholes, wiring the cabin lights, fitting the last of the interior cabinetry. The project, once an insurmountable mountain, now had a summit in sight. There was quiet talk of a launch date before the first deep snows of winter arrived. The first sign of trouble came not as a shout, but as a whisper on the wind. It began to blow from the northeast, a direction that always put the old fisherman on edge. The sky took on a strange, bruised yellow color, and the sea, instead of its usual cheerful chop, began to build into long, oily swells that broke with a heavy, ominous boom against the seawall. The warnings started on the marine radio, at first just a watch for a strong coastal low. But within hours the language became more severe: gale force, hurricane force. A nor'easter of historic proportions was forming, a swirling monster of wind and water, and Port Clyde was directly in its path. A cold knot of fear formed in Ethan's stomach. The boats in the harbor were in danger, but they could be secured with extra lines, their bows pointed into the wind to ride out the storm. The Sea Spirit, however, was terrifyingly vulnerable. She was still on land, a massive, high-sided vessel sitting on a wooden cradle. A sustained broadside wind could, in a worst-case scenario, knock her clean over, smashing months of painstaking work in a single night. The unspoken anxiety spread through the town. By late afternoon, the men who had spent their weekends helping Ethan gathered at the shipyard. Gus, Silas, Finn, and a half-dozen others stood with their arms crossed, staring at the beautiful, vulnerable boat as the wind whipped around them. Salty stood close to Ethan, his body tense, sensing the collective fear of the men. "We'll run lines from the masthead to the pylons," Gus said, his usual booming voice tight with worry. "And tie down the cradle to the old engine block." "It's not enough," Silas countered, squinting at the sky. 100-knot gust hits her beam, and she'll go over like a toy. That cradle wasn't built for this. They argued for 10 minutes, their voices rising with the wind, proposing and dismissing ideas. They were all experienced men, masters of their own vessels. But this was a unique problem, a ship caught between the land and the sea. Ethan remained silent, listening. He let them speak, respecting the decades of hard-won knowledge in their voices. He was no longer the town's broken recluse. He was one of them now, but he was not yet their leader. He listened to their plans, their fears, and weighed them against the cold, hard physics he had learned in the Navy, the brutal mathematics of wind and force and leverage. Finally, when there was a lull in the debate, a moment of frustrated silence, Ethan spoke. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the rising wind. "They're good ideas," he said respectfully, "but they all focus on pinning her down. A storm this strong, you can't fight it head on. You have to distribute the load. You have to let her move, just a little." The men turned to look at him, their expressions skeptical. Ethan knelt and picked up a piece of driftwood, and in the dirt and gravel of the shipyard, he began to sketch. In the Navy, when we had to secure something heavy on a pitching deck, we used a spiderweb mooring. We don't just anchor her to 2 or 3 points. We use 8, 10. We sink deadman anchors in the ground, here and here. He drew crosses in the dirt around the boat. We run lines from multiple points on the hull, not just the cradle, to all of those anchors. We keep them taut, but not rigid. It creates a web, a cradle of lines. When the wind hits, the force isn't absorbed by 1 or 2 points. It's spread across the entire web. The boat can shift, it can rock, but it can't break free, and it can't tip. He looked up. The fishermen were staring at his crude drawing, their brows furrowed in concentration. It was a complex, time-consuming setup, completely different from their traditional methods. "That's a hell of a lot of rope," Gus said, scratching his beard. "I know," Ethan replied, "but it's our best chance." It was Finn who spoke next. He had been watching Ethan, a look of intense scrutiny on his face. He knelt, his old knees cracking, and studied the diagram in the dirt. He traced the lines with a gnarled finger, his lips moving silently. Finally, he looked up at the other men. "The boy's right," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "The old ways are for harbor storms. This isn't a harbor storm. This is a battle. His plan gives the boat a fighting chance." He looked at Ethan, and in his sharp blue eyes was a look of profound, hard-won respect. That was all it took. The debate was over. A new energy surged through the small group, a unified sense of purpose. Ethan, the quiet man they had pitied, then helped, had now offered them wisdom. He had earned his place at the heart of their circle, not through sympathy, but through knowledge. The work began immediately, a frantic, coordinated race against the coming darkness and the fury of the sea. The storm did not arrive. It attacked. It came ashore with a primal scream, a physical wall of wind and water that slammed into the coast of Maine. The sky turned a churning, malevolent black, and the rain was no longer falling, but flying horizontally, as sharp and stinging as pellets of ice. The world dissolved into a deafening chaos of roaring wind and the percussive crash of waves against the shore. At the shipyard, a small band of men kept a grim vigil. Ethan, Finn, Gus, and Silas were huddled in the relative shelter of Finn's largest workshop, its heavy timber walls groaning under the assault. The building's main cargo door was rolled open just enough for them to see the Sea Spirit, illuminated in the stark, sweeping beams of their parked trucks. Salty was with them, pressed close to Ethan's leg, his body trembling not from fear, but from the sheer vibratory force of the storm. For the first few hours, Ethan's spider web of lines performed flawlessly. The men watched in a state of terrified awe as the boat was hammered by gusts that sounded like freight trains. The Sea Spirit shuddered and rocked on her cradle, her tall mast whipping violently against the black sky. But the web of ropes held her fast. Each gust that should have threatened to topple her was instead absorbed and distributed among the dozen anchor points, the entire system flexing and groaning like a living thing, but never breaking. There were muttered words of approval, grim nods of respect for the Navy wisdom that was keeping their boat alive. The true crisis came just after midnight, when the storm surge peaked. A monstrous wave, far larger than the others, breached the old seawall. It was a churning wall of white water and debris that roared through the lower section of the shipyard. It slammed into the Sea Spirit's cradle, not with the force of wind, but with the unstoppable, hydraulic power of the ocean itself. The men in the workshop saw the boat lurch violently. They held their breath, but the main lines held. In the chaos and the dark, they couldn't see the specific point of failure. The surge had ripped a secondary anchor post, a heavy steel pile they had driven deep into the ground, clean from the saturated earth. One of the 10 crucial lines went slack. It drooped, and the wind immediately caught it, whipping it violently back and forth. The loose steel cable began to thrash against a sharp metal corner of the boat's cradle. In the roar of the wind, the high-pitched shriek of metal grinding against metal was completely lost to the human ear. No one saw it. No one heard it. The one weak link in their armor had been exposed, and it was slowly, invisibly, being sawed in two. It was Salty who sounded the alarm. While the men were focused on the awesome, terrible spectacle outside, the dog's attention was fixed on something else. His head was cocked, his ears twitching, honing in on a single, discordant sound within the symphony of destruction. It was a high-frequency, rhythmic grating noise that was utterly alien to the natural chaos of the storm. He sprang to his feet with a low growl. It wasn't his usual warning sound. This was different. This was frantic. He ran to the edge of the open door and began to bark, a volley of sharp, desperate sounds directed not at the storm in general, but toward one specific, dark corner of the boat's cradle. "Easy, boy," Ethan said, putting a hand on his back. "It's just the wind." But Salty would not be silenced. He ignored Ethan's touch, his barking growing more intense, more insistent. He ran back to Ethan, pawed at his leg, and then ran back to the door, looking back with a desperate plea in his eyes. He was not scared. He was trying to tell them something. "He's never acted like this," Finn said, his sharp eyes fixed on the dog. "Something's wrong." Trusting his dog's instincts over his own senses, Ethan grabbed a powerful, waterproof flashlight from the workbench. "Stay here," he yelled, to the others over the roar. He braced himself and plunged out into the maelstrom. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet. Salty was beside him in an instant, a soaked, loyal shadow in the screaming dark. Ethan aimed the bright beam of the flashlight in the direction Salty had indicated. At first he saw nothing but a curtain of driving rain. Then the beam caught it. A shower of tiny, bright orange sparks, vanishing as quickly as they appeared. He moved closer, his heart seizing in his chest. The beam found the source. It was the loose cable, vibrating under tension, grinding itself to death against the steel cradle. He could see that several of the cable's smaller strands had already snapped, their broken ends flailing in the wind. It wouldn't last another 10 minutes. "The aft port line," Ethan roared, turning back to the workshop. "It's going to break!" The men needed no other explanation. They burst from the workshop, armed with ropes and tools. What followed was a desperate, dangerous battle against the storm. With Silas and Gus manning safety lines, Ethan and Finn crept out into the gale. The wind tried to tear the tools from their hands and the air from their lungs. Working in the focused beam of the flashlight, they managed to attach a new, heavy-duty rope to the cable, bypassing the frayed section, and secure it to the main frame of an old, immovable winch. It was a brutal, exhausting 20 minutes. When they were finally finished, the new line was taut, the strain on the damaged cable relieved. They stumbled back into the workshop, soaked to the bone, chests heaving, but a new sense of hope burning in their eyes. The storm still raged outside, but the immediate danger had passed. The sea spirit was secure once more. Ethan dropped to his knees and pulled Salty into a fierce embrace, burying his face in the dog's wet, cold fur. "You did it, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved her. You saved everything." The dog he had rescued from the wreckage of the shipyard had just returned the favor, his unwavering loyalty a beacon in the longest, darkest night. The dawn that followed the longest night was one of profound, crystalline silence. The wind was gone. The sea, exhausted from its fury, had settled into a gentle, rhythmic swell. The sky was washed clean, a pale, hopeful blue. The town of Port Clyde emerged slowly, blinking in the new light, to survey the damage. There were downed trees, a few damaged roofs, and the main pier had lost a section of its railing, but the town had held. And, at the shipyard, the sea spirit stood magnificent and unharmed. Her web of lines had held her fast, a testament to a Navy man's wisdom, an old man's guidance, and a community's shared resolve. As Ethan, Finn, and the others gathered in the quiet morning, no one spoke for a long time. They just looked at the boat, their faces etched with exhaustion and a deep, bone-weary pride. Ethan knelt and wrapped his arms around Salty, who licked the salt spray from his face. They had done it. They had weathered the storm. Together. The weeks that followed were filled with a final, joyful burst of energy. The sails arrived, crisp and white, and were bent to the mast. The last of the brass fittings were polished until they shone like gold. And then, one bright, clear Saturday in late autumn, the day arrived. It felt as though the entire town of Port Clyde had gathered to watch. They lined the shore and the undamaged sections of the pier, their faces bright with anticipation. A massive travel lift was positioned over the Sea Spirit, its heavy straps slipped beneath her hull. The air was thick with a tense, excited silence as the machine whirred to life, lifting the boat from the cradle that had been her home for so long. She swung out over the water, graceful and perfect, her new blue hull reflecting the clear autumn sky. Then, slowly, she was lowered. She touched the water with a gentle kiss, then settled, floating with a perfect easy grace. A cheer erupted from the crowd, a joyous, heartfelt sound that echoed across the harbor. Finn stood beside Ethan, a rare, watery smile in his bright blue eyes. "She's home," the old man said, his voice thick with emotion. Later that afternoon, after the crowds had dispersed, Ethan knew what he had to do. With Salty standing proudly on the bow, his nose to the wind, Ethan cast off the lines for the Sea Spirit's maiden voyage. It wasn't a long journey. He motored slowly out of the harbor, the boat cutting cleanly through the water, her engine a low, steady thrum. He navigated to a set of coordinates he had found in the back of Clara's journal, a location a few miles offshore with a clear view of the coastline she had loved so much. When he reached the spot, he cut the engine. A profound silence descended, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the hull and the cry of a distant gull. He had thought this moment would be filled with a sharp, wrenching grief. He had planned to say goodbye, to let go of the last of her ashes that he carried in a small, carved box. But as he stood at the helm, the salty air on his face and the solid deck beneath his feet, he felt something else entirely. It was peace. A deep, quiet sense of calm that settled over him like a warm blanket. He looked back at the shore, at the small, tight-knit collection of houses that was Port Clyde. He thought of Finn's gruff wisdom, of Mrs. Gable's quiet kindness, of Gus and Silas and the other men who had given their time and their strength without asking for anything in return. He thought of the long months of shared labor, the coffee shared on cold mornings, the communal victory against the storm. Clara's dream had been to sail away, to see the world, just the two of them. But in finishing her dream, he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. A community, a family. He realized with a sudden, stunning clarity that the journey of rebuilding the boat had been more meaningful than any solitary voyage around the world could ever be. He hadn't just been restoring a vessel, he and the town had been restoring a man. He opened the small box, but he did not scatter the ashes. He simply held it to his heart for a moment. A silent thank you, a quiet promise. "I'm home, Clara," he thought. "We're home." He didn't sell the boat. He didn't sail away. He stayed. The following spring, a new, beautifully carved sign appeared on the main pier. Sea Spirit Coastal Tours. Captain Ethan Hale. He began taking small groups of tourists out for day sails, sharing the beauty of the coast his wife had so adored. He taught the town's children the basics of sailing on warm summer afternoons, their laughter echoing across the water. The story ends on one such evening. The last of the children have been returned to their parents, their faces glowing with sun and excitement. Now, it is just Ethan and Salty on the water. A gentle breeze fills the mainsail, pushing the Sea Spirit quietly across the bay as the sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange, pink, and gold. Ethan stands at the helm, one hand resting lightly on the tiller. Salty sits beside him, his head resting on his master's thigh, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if he, too, understands the beauty of this moment. The lines of grief have softened on Ethan's face, replaced by a quiet strength. He is no longer haunted. He is home. As he guides the boat toward the twinkling lights of the harbor, a slow, genuine smile spreads across his face. It is the smile of a man who has navigated the darkest of storms and found, on the other side, a calm and peaceful sea is less than Hashon. 5. Ethan's journey reminds us that sometimes the greatest voyages are not the ones that take us across the sea, but the ones that guide us back to ourselves, often with a loyal friend leading the way. Salty was more than a dog. He was the anchor that held fast in the storm of grief. If their story of hope and healing resonated with you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need it. We would love to read your thoughts in the comments below, and we invite you to subscribe to our channel for more tales like this. Your next adventure is ready to begin. Just click the video that has now appeared on your screen.